Well, I could start with
And we are live. Welcome everybody to Aeon Byte Live. I think it's episode 17 or 18, not sure. It's been quite an interesting week, but welcome everybody. We'll give a minute for everybody to go into the chat room as we will be taking questions from our audience. And again, welcome everybody and welcome to the Desert of the Real. On this episode, we will be discussing, somebody's got a bit of an echo. I think it's Kevin. Let's see, put him on mute for a second. There you go. So again, welcome to the Desert of the Real. Heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it just is. It just is. And before we start, it's not that much fun today. I know this has been... for many listeners at AM Byte and for people in the esoterica, it is a dark week. We had a past guest, an acquaintance, somebody whose work I admired very well, and that was Tracy Twyman. She tragically and sadly died this week. I want to talk more about it in our next show, but I thought I'd mention, out of respect of the dead, and also not to talk too much, but for those of you out there, perhaps to offer a prayer and a thought for her family and to keep her memory alive, which I plan to do that. Again, talking more about it in the next show and in future shows, future articles. And anyway, just a sad thing, as the poems say, and death shall have no dominion and death shall be proud, two poems that I often always read in these times when we lose those who were close to us, or those we admired, those we followed. And of course, to the guest today, if you feel like reading a little bit about death from your own works and so forth, I'm sure that will be a sort of prayer to the eternal. This is Saturn's realm, and Kyrie eleison. Saturn still rules. These are his rules. And down here, we do the best we can to understand transcendence and to keep those who have left us alive by their memories and make them eternal, even though they were always eternal. So I just wanted to say that. And the topic today will be the Romantics. Definitely a group of poets that my favorite group, and of course it's no secret that I really love William Blake. He is definitely a patron saint to Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, and so are others like Coleridge and so forth, which we will talk more today. So, but we are truly honored with two wonderful guests. And first of all, we are joined by Aria Ligi. Aria, thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte. Really appreciate having you on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Honor is all ours. And also definitely honored to have back at the virtual Alexandria for a second time is the wonderful and great Kevin Kiely. How are you doing, Kevin? Great to have you on, my friend. Oh, let me get you off mute. My fault. There you go. Go ahead, Kevin. Sorry.
Well, greetings to you, Miguel, and I'll have to try to not be over vaulting with that introduction you've given me.
No problem. I'm sure we'll let the spirit move us and inspiration take us as we may. And with us, with always his wonderful backdrops. And of course, it's a win-win when you can bring in Blake's visionary art, and that is the Moondog Vance. How you doing, Vance?
Pretty well. I'm looking forward to listening to lots of poetry because I'm an engineer now. Engineers don't know anything about poetry, so I'm going to learn.
Well, like I always say, poetry, they are the shamans of our days. They're the ones who take that deep dive into the collective unconscious, into the world of symbols, and bring back these energies that help the tribe and help the world. Very underrated poets, I think, today, and certainly underrated are the Romantic poets. So that's why we're doing this show. And again, welcome those of you at the chat room. Vance will be taking questions. So please, I think you like what, two question marks at the end, Vance? Is that what you like to make sure to flag you? Vance, did you hear me?
No, my phone interrupted my Bluetooth screen.
Anyway, Vance will be taking questions, and if
Yeah, I will. Yeah.
we do have super chats, so if anybody wants to help with some money, you will be put at the top of the line. But we try to get to everybody's questions for sure. And another, of course, as always, I should announce that this will have an audio version. This is YouTube Live, but it will be on YouTube, and we'll have an audio version in a few days in all our podcasting channels, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and all those places where you can download this full interview. And I'll probably have some bonuses as always. And also need to announce that we do have a new Discord channel for supporters. Some of you don't know how to get there, so just email me at miguel@thegodabovegod.com if you want to join our Discord. And for those who want to help too, I have started an Amazon wish list. I know many of you don't trust PayPal or Patreon very wisely. I appreciate those who mail in donations or help, but do have a Amazon wish list if you want to help out with equipment. We can always use the help with our equipment here at the Virtual Alexandria. So those announcements out of the way and all other news, let's get poetic. Let's talk about the Romantics, not the band, but of course, if somebody wants to sing What I Like About You or something like that, go ahead. We actually want to do some poetry. So let's start with you, Aria. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your work that you do.
Well, let's see. Keeping in line with the Romantics, since that is our focus, I have written a 14-book series, which is actually called The Romantics, starting with Wordsworth, and then going from Wordsworth to Coleridge, because those two are often seen as the fathers of the Romantic movement. And then going all the way through from Shelley, Byron, Keats, Leigh Hunt, who's often unsung, Dorothy Wordsworth, and then, of course, William Blake, Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Robinson. And then the very last book is a compilation of poems that I wrote for the Blue Stocking women, who are really not talked about as much.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yes, I read your book last night, Hammer of God, and I really love the poetry. I plan to use some of your audio versions and when we put out the audio show, because it's beautiful stuff, certainly harkens to the Romantics. But for those who might not know, what is the definition of a romantic, Aria?
Well, to me, and Kevin can correct me if he thinks I'm wrong, but I think that a romantic poet is, as I like to say, it's not pertaining to flowers and hearts and greeting cards or Valentine's Day. It's really a hearkening to the Enlightenment and the ideals of Rousseau and the French Revolution, which I think is also something that, given the political climate that we're all living in right now, is extremely salient. Because to me, if you can look back at history and learn, and then take something from that and go forward, and really take it into your heart, then poetry has done its job. It's also, I think, one of the reasons why, if you look at throughout history, poets have been the ones, and even now, who, when they write about things that are really politically challenging the powers that be, they're the ones that are called to account for it. And that's what a lot of the Enlightenment poetry did, and a lot of Romantic poetry did. It was really a beckoning call for the masses. So that's, a long explanation.
No, good one. And we certainly want to unpack more, because I think, to me, obviously, the Romantics were about sort of a rebellion against dry reason and the more mechanical parts of the Enlightenment, which brought us, the darker parts of the French Revolution and other movements that later would come in the 19th and 20th century. To me, they also harken back to to the classic times, that classic gnosis, and sort of embraced nature, being embedded in nature as nature was beginning to be raped by humanity in the 18th and 19th century. So, like you said, an essential thing in those days, and very, very essential and relevant today as we are raping the earth and we are creating mechanistic societies and transhuman societies right in front of our eyes. So, okay, Kevin, to you, I'd like to know your thoughts on who do you think on the Romantics, their legacy, and what have we missed?
This is a vast subject, and I need to address immediately what you're saying. It's lovely to hear Aria say what she said, and you've just said it. So I think if I keep it as succinct as possible, because you mentioned the denudation of the world, and Aria's mentioning politics and the concept of the Romantics. Not to be a devil's advocate, but I think Blake would like the idea of devils and angels and mixing everything together. The movement, and it is a movement, still holds its validity. Surprisingly, I find this, and if I could put it under a few headings, there is the dimension of being in this world, but not being comfortable in it. I'm leaning on Blake here, and his vision seems to be, I'm going to just throw 4 lines out because I don't want to be speaking for Blake, let him speak for himself. It would seem that there's always a duality in Blake, which is he doesn't like the word optimism. It is what we call the holding ground. So it is possible for us to be here once, according to Blake, we see that there are these an extraordinary series of dualities. I'll give 4 lines just to put the thing in context. I have some markings here. This would be pertinent. Love seeketh only self to please, to bind another to its delight, joys in another's loss of ease, and builds a hell in heaven's despite. Love seeketh only self to please, to bind another to its delight, joys in another's loss of ease, and builds a hell in heaven's despite. The great thing about those lines is the fact that they would seem to somebody who might point at the 4 of us and say, you're reading very old lines, but they're really very, very new. They're even way ahead, in that in the love duality, already he's with his antinomies and opposites. It can be love of the planet, love of the street here. There's people fighting for some trees down where I am. So there's a continual quest, isn't there? So some people are pleased about this tree, this tree saving to bind another to its delight. But then there's other people who want the joy and the loss of ease, and this marriage of heaven and hell, which is one aspect of Blake's work, which I have happily learned from him, that we must assent to this duality. We can't have, Aria said it there, making me laugh. No, the Romantics are not about have a lovely day, I hope you enjoy your holidays, the coffee is great. We're being forced all the time to go below the ground and say, Blake would even say, where did the coffee beans come from, etc., etc. That's the great engagement with the Romantics.
Well said, my friend. And it's interesting, Kevin, when you were talking in our last interview on Yeats, you talked about somebody should analyze heavy metal, the lyrics. And that made me laugh because there was a show that Eric Davis, who was recently on the show to talk about Philip K. Dick, in his podcast, he was talking also about his admiration for William Blake. And he said, there is a heavy metal thunder to William Blake. And I was like, aha, he has it. It's not, again, about angels and all that. There is sort of a power, an elan vital on steroids on Blake. I mean, there is even the famous instance where the philosopher Ginsberg he read Blake and had to masturbate because it was so powerful and overtook him. So there is that connection. And I know, of course, Iron Maiden did, you know, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner and all that, but there is a connection. There is a power to Blake. And of course, I would say it's Gnostic. But then, of course, you read Alan Moore's From Hell, and he sort of makes Blake into this dark prophet of the solar technological age. And of course, Thomas Harris in Red Dragon, he seems to make Blake into, again, this dark prophet of technology and transhumanism. But regardless of whether you see Blake, England's poem, there is a lot of power behind them.
Yeah, I'm delighted you've mentioned that, and I hope we don't have to go back in material. When you mentioned Blake's painting of the Red Dragon, absolutely. There is something which I confess immediately to in Blake, even where I am now, having come across him, is that without hyperbole, you can meet the horror of existence in Blake's work. It's not hyperbole, and it's not an extraordinary thing to say, but also you meet, this is where I may tend to come across as somebody who could be deranged, is that Blake, I have to say in your broadcast and in a discussion about him, he cannot be seen other than an avatar and an angelic being. It is, I think, impossible if we were to open this to 300 or 400 people and have a broadcast for a week. I believe we would have to come out in the end and say, and it's not that you're agreeing with me, but we're agreeing with people who've commentated and mentioned on him. I cannot explain this, Miguel. Maybe we can explain it today, but it somehow gives Blake Blake doesn't want to be called a preacher, I know this. When we come to Coleridge, remember, Lamb, somebody said to Lamb after Coleridge had died, well, of course, he was a preacher. And Lamb said, no, that's not an accurate nomenclature for Coleridge. We always would joke him and say, you're continually preaching at us. But I mean, it's not that sort of a thing. So going back on the point, Blake's ability to deal with our life and his life and what he has left us, what is, again, it's difficult not to be involved in superlatives about this particular human being, but again, angelic. So Blake was here at this time, brought these paintings, wrote these poems, was a very difficult character. I'd have to admit this, even in the Peter Ackroyd biography. I think slip him back 200 years and he would have been, God forbid, put on the bonfire, you know, with Giordano Bruno and others. He escaped the bonfire. He did go to court for one time, and he, I think, eloquently and brilliantly got out of it, because it was a horrendous George III session in England. That king, I'll try not to go.
Time in jail with one of the founding fathers. I forget.
Yeah, Blake. I can't.
In jail for sedition.
I suppose Blake's personality was of such a high vibration and of such a low vibration then in aggression, that he must have sometimes come across as highly suspicious, that type of angelic gentility. But he wasn't clinked, as we now say. But that's a separate issue. But right through the work is this confrontation all the time, something which Rainer Maria Rilke and others pick up on, that yes, where we are at the moment, I can't but deal in these terms. Where one is, there is, you know, the good things and the evil things. And of course, it couldn't be but more apparent, you know, it could not be more apparent. You know, when you're in a city, Blake brings you to a city and he talks about the starving children. We know when we go to a city now, we know what he was telling us, and we know what Byron was telling us to say, and the way Byron attacks institutions in London. He's telling us that when you go around any city, there's all these hellish places as well as the parks and the fountains. So that is the great sanity of these writers. That is the great, what you call Docetus. They don't want to be called teachers, but I could say to somebody, it sounds like a medical prescription. Your crisis could maybe your crisis could be solved by picking up a book with Blake, 50 paintings and 20 poems. It's an incredible thing, isn't it? Maybe.
Indeed, indeed. And Aria, for you, what is your take on Blake and his contribution? I mean, he was somebody, as Kevin is alluding to, he was, well, today we think of him as a strange duck, somebody who saw angels as he walked out on the street and talked to the supernatural. And of course, that he had definitely a very Gnostic vibe, as I see in your poetry too. So what do you think really inspired Blake, and what is his legacy today or forever? I mean, he died unknown, which terrifies all of us who are writers, but
well,
the legacy.
I love that Kevin referenced Peter Ackroyd's book, because I had some issues with that book, but the book that I actually really loved was the one by Bentley. I don't know if Kevin's read that one, but it's really excellent. And, the thing that I remember with Blake, a couple of things. One is that, his upbringing was very unusual. He was actually sort of homeschooled before homeschooling was a thing. And, really brought up in this rather untraditional background, with the Swedenborgianism and, what today I think would be termed early evangelicals, but not evangelicals in the modern Christian sense that we know them to be in America, but actually a very more Unitarian sort of approach. And, he also, I think because of that, his mind was a lot more expansive than what people think of. Even when they think William Blake, they don't really see the totality of who he was. One of the things that a couple of things that I always think of with him is that he really, really detested domestic violence, and in particular, the treatment of children at that time. There was a time when he was living with his wife in a cottage, and they had this neighbor, and he looked out the window because he heard screaming, and the neighbor was hitting his son in the head. And Blake got very, very upset and ran over there and yelled at the guy and made him promise never to hit his son again, which I thought it was so beautiful, because it was something that really, really bothered him. He's also the first person, I believe, to actually write a bill that would outlaw child labor in Parliament. It was written by Blake. And the other thing that I always think of him, he said something that I thought was pretty interesting, and he was really vilified for it. He said, "I am God, you are God." And, the people there were just horrified. Oh my God, blasphemy. But I think what he really meant was that the essence of spirituality is in you, and it's in me, and it's in every single being. It's in, plant life. It's in everything. And so, of course, they were horrified because they didn't understand what he was saying. And the other thing that he said, which I think of often, especially in the current climate that we're in, is he said that the temporal world is hell. And when you die, you go home. And I think he's right. And I if you look at all the terrible things that are going on now and have gone on throughout time with human suffering and the way humans treat each other, and the crisis that we're all in with the planet, he's right. So, and I think that that's really his message to us, is that, to quote Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which sounds like a weird quote, but it does make sense.
Love Buffy.
I do too. Which is, the hardest thing in this world is to live in it. And I think he would get that.
That's really well said. Yeah, I think Blake also said all deities are in the breast. And I think, yeah, he had an incredible message, very hermetic, very Gnostic, very transcendental, and very eternal. And I would agree with Blake, this place is hell. And but we're here doing something about it. And of course, if I don't need to be orchestrating except with my head this week, not only with what happened, the darkness that happened, but the Archons have been attacking our technology, Vance and I's technology. They've been relentless, and we are great. We are grateful. But if Aria has a question for Kevin, or Kevin has a question for me, or anybody, let's just have a good conversation. I could talk forever and ask questions forever, but we are here to have a good time. And Vance, anybody in the room have a question for our guest, or you have a question?
Don't see any so far, but and I don't have a question, but I'm enjoying it. I am a great appreciator of romantic poetry.
Good deal. Good deal. Kevin, do you have anything to say about Blake or any of the other poets? I know you mentioned Coleridge, and after Blake, he was one of my favorite. I can't believe he's a minister, because he was my psychedelic guy. It was when I was in college, getting stoned and listening to Kubla Khan or Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner was one of my favorite things in the world. His poetry is, yeah, again, it's transcendental. It's psychedelic. Blake's heavy metal thunder, but Coleridge is psychedelic 60s or something.
Well, the thing, yes, look, we're here to, I suppose, we can have a couple of laughs as well, for God's sake. No, I'll ask Aria later about, because I've read her book about William Cooper, and he's lingering out there in my hallway, so I'm not gonna go out and bring him in. The book I mean. But to go on to Coleridge, I just was having a look because you had invited me on, and to contrast them for a minute, and I won't go on too long. Blake seems to be, as it were, in this group we're speaking about today. You know, Blake, Byron, Keats, Shelley, Coleridge. Coleridge seems to be, to me, when I read The Mariner there last night, I've realized that it's far shorter than I thought, and read his confessional poems, Frost at Midnight and the Aeolian Harp. He is, as it were, involved not in focusing on the antimonies. He's more living in a lot of different hells, a domestic hell, the hell of addiction. I think this is, as you say, I'm not accusing you, I'm not accusing your student days or your early working days of being an opium addict and having, you know, I
was an addict, Kevin. I had to get help.
I washed my lip here, as we say. But Coleridge certainly, and he doesn't want, I know that in his lines, he doesn't want to be seen as a pitiable being, but he is a very pitiable being. And there's something where Blake's fate and destiny seem to be very bit like Coleridge. This is the great thing that everybody's trying to do. For me, Blake was able to steer his bark, steer his destiny, and get what he wanted to get done while he was here in an extraordinary manner. Wordsworth the same, but Coleridge, and I could not be permitted to judge him, but Coleridge seemed to be, you know, banging off the walls, falling out the window, losing his shoes, falling in the river. He's very much like Horace's, the great Quintus Horatio in Rome, who said that, you know the poet because he's continually falling into the fountain, falling into debt, or falling into the Tiber. So Coleridge in a way represents that raggy, rake, bohemian type of Arthur Rimbaud character. But there's something extremely tragic. I'd forgotten The Mariner. And that's the Mariner is this, it's not fair to say he's a Gothic character, because when Coleridge was writing it, he had no notion of that as a genre. But the Mariner is bringing the wedding guest away from the joys of community and saying, think of your fate. What is your fate? Have you confronted it? My fate was I shot this bird. I did this deed against everybody. Look at what it has done to me. And the wedding guest says, well, I'm going to a wedding. I've got my clothes on. I'm going to go in and have a gin and tonic, you know, and I've got my girlfriend is in there. Leave me alone. Get your hand off me. But then also the poem is saying to us, what is your destiny? What are you doing with your destiny? Because the mariner has told you that it's again close to the antimonies, and it is something I'm afraid that is part of our ticket here. Some people are going to have a difficult destiny, and their signs are being shown to you. The mariner is saying to this man, you don't know what your destiny is. Of course, it is the reader when we read this. And the mariner took some deviation and is paying for killing this bird. For a whole 2 sections of the poem, the bird is hanging around him. Of course, it's suffused with symbolism. The strange thing about this poem is that so many people went off and wrote other poems inimical of it, or got the message. As we know, Stefan Mallarmé made his longest poem based on the mariner, based on one little stanza in the mariner, suddenly realizing one night, what is my destiny? What do I do with this situation? And I think to bring our other pantheon together, Byron is the same thing. Byron has a really, I'm going into this mode that people do nowadays, talking about the past and the continuous present. Byron has a very, very complex destiny, and it's kind of slapping him in the wrist all the time, and yet he goes down and can't do much about it. Shelley has this unbelievably difficult destiny. Shelley is the man who was killed in a mugging, as people would say in Americanese, journalese. It's an atrocious piece of destiny, but it is contained in his work. This is the thing. Coleridge's forecast of his life is in that poem he wrote in his 20s. But again, Keats. So you were talking earlier about, losing a friend. I must say as well, I must mention somebody, because we're not at a wedding. We're at a poetry wedding, or whatever sort of wedding it is, an alchemical wedding. Yeah, I had a colloquial friend, a friend in the north, and he took his own life about 10 days ago. And I'm not gonna put the shadow of his spirit over us. Paul Moore. I just want to mention Paul. And I didn't know him particularly well, but some of the other people in the group I was involved with up there, they knew him very well. And it's again, I can't say this, and I don't want to say it, but I went to a play that he wrote, and he helped me. I was I had a play, and he was giving me some artistic advice with other people. But getting away from myself, back to Paul Moore. When I think of it now, this is the thing. In that play, there was the sort of feed in. God, I don't know, like that he would have this ultimate confrontation. So this is what I'm saying, not standing up on my wine box here, which is empty. These poets are not just writing poems. There's a type of holographic situation, a type of prophetic situation, that they live out themselves parallel with the poems. So it's, to use that kind of news on the hour thing, it's a kind of a deadly serious. It's more deadly serious than the news flash, because they're telling you, they're talking to you before the news hits the news flash. So that's why there's a comfort. I find a comfort particularly in Wordsworth. I definitely say that. To be personal here, I use Wordsworth as a doorstop, and the 1 or 2 guests I have, they drop in, and there would be people like I'm talking to, they say, well, why? What the hell is Wordsworth holding up that door? It's just that he's available to me on the thing. Kipling is holding up the door today because Wordsworth's on the table, but it's just that Keats and Shelley are people you look at, and they're in a crisis, and they're coping with this crisis. And Coleridge is, to use the most beautiful essay written by your compatriot there, Thomas Stearns Eliot. Eliot's essay, Eliot keeps saying, I can't but pity Coleridge. I can't but pity his poetry. The fact that he got married, and then the fact that he fell in love with Wordsworth's sister's wife, the complications of Coleridge's life, the complications of his opium addiction, his alcoholism, his inability to to begin a book and then leave the book in the coach or lose the book or drop the book. It's extraordinary that he was able to cope with these things. Whereas the calmness down under Blake, if I just give a line of Blake, Blake is able to say to you, I saw a serpent rise between the white pillars of the door, and he forced and forced and forced down the golden hinges tore, and along the pavement sweet, set with pearls and rubies bright, and all his slimy length he drew, till upon the altar white, vomiting his poison out on the bread and on the wine. And look at the way it ends. So I turned into a sty and laid me down among the swine. So Blake is, I can't turn into somebody rattling a pulpit or a wine box, but Blake is saying to you, the imagination I'll come on to, but Blake is saying in the rational world we live in, you have to think of these things. You have been given this ticket into this extraordinary cosmic situation. You now are God. I mean, I'm afraid of using these names, God. I'm afraid to use them. God, you're God and Jesus and Jehovah and Buddha. You are the cosmic being in this particular journey. Now, what are you going to do?
Well said, and I'm sorry about your friend. I mean, unfortunately, that's the reality. Poets and artists and writers, we go down into the dark underground of the subconscious, and sometimes we are attacked by demons. Sometimes the archons get us, and sometimes it's more supernatural. You're talking about Shelley and your friend writing the poet. I can remember writing stuff in my teens that came true. My downfalls were right there. I mean, to the T. Shelley, he saw himself before his death on the ship, and some say that's like the doppelganger. If you see yourself out on the road, it means death is coming. And he did write about that, or I think he'd written about his death. I mean, it is there. So what do you think, Aria? Why do poets and writers, you yourself are one, why so much darkness?
Well, I think it's the duality of the soul that, we're looking into. And just to toggle back to Coleridge, I part of his sadness, and I'm sorry to say this, was kind of Wordsworth, because Wordsworth made some very unkind comments about him. And he also did something that I think really hurt Coleridge, because what he did was he decided that in lyrical ballads, he was just going to excise out a lot of the poems that Coleridge wanted in there. And, and Coleridge, it was written, said that he felt that he was a lesser poet than Wordsworth, and he felt like he should never write again. And of course, he did continue writing, but I think that wound really, really exacerbated all the other issues that he had, because who he was as a writer was who he was, almost to the point of who he was as a man. And, his addiction, especially to opium, I don't know if people realize this, but opium causes constipation, and he had severe bouts of constipation. He had to take something called black bark to alleviate that. There were times when he was traveling, I think it was to Malta, and he was so sick on board the vessel that he thought he was going to die, vomiting and constipated throughout the entire ride. So those are things that, I read and I feel it physically, just reading what he went through. But, he also wrote, and I have it here because I just thought this was so beautiful. He wrote a poem which was about the French Revolution and about their times, called Fire, Famine, and Slaughter, a War Eclogue. It's actually one of my favorites of his. And I don't know if anybody's had the time to read it, but it's just beautiful, because it's a conversation poem, which is something that I don't want to say he invented it, because obviously Homer, and did, which you could sort of say were conversation poems. But it's really beautiful because it has famine talking and slaughter talking and fire talking, and it's all these different elements of what are part of a war. And then it goes back to talking about hell and talking about starvation. And, you know, it's something that actually could be written right now, which is one of the reasons why I think it's so pertinent. And then to Byron, I actually read Byron for solace. I adore him because there are bits and passages, especially in Don Juan, that are so beautiful that I can read that, and it's something that you can reflect on and take into heart. You know, sometimes you read something and you never think about it again. But with Don Juan, it's not the same. I read it and it stays with you. And that's when you know you have something.
Well said. Nate, I think I saw a question by Nate Vance for the audience, or from the audience to our guests.
Yes, he was wondering if there's a relationship between altered states in the poets, or if the poets experienced altered states, or if the altered states was part of the creation of their poetry, that type of idea.
Kevin?
Gosh, and I don't should I say hello, Nathan? Because I'm just seeing 4 people. But I look, hello, Nathan, or maybe it's Jonathan. Well, to do my best, there is absolute proof. My use of absolute proof is based on what these people have written. Blake definitely, for one, has brought into what we might call the aesthetics of poetry that, I don't have the quote, of course, with me at the moment. The little devils have hidden it. But the point is that Blake intimates extremely clearly that he's, I suppose this came up again, Miguel and I talking about Yeats, that there's a difference between just trying to write a poem and then somehow receiving the poem. I don't want to sound too sanctimonious, or, you know, I don't want to put on a mitre on my head and start pontificating, but it would seem an absolute certainty, you know, let it be Mozart's, you know, Requiem, let it be a piece of Messiaen. It would seem that there's a takeover from the person, you know, it's a little bit like somebody else is driving the car, to use a very, what we call mechanical issue. So again, going to Aria, and I would like to resurrect Coleridge as well, and I'm sure Aria will help me. While Coleridge does have this extraordinary, piteous Hamlet, Richard II type of life, I was going to say, my God, lifestyle, that would be the wrong thing to say, but life, that what is the great thing, why I love Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and why we all love Samuel Taylor Coleridge, those of us who do love him, is that he managed to come up on top of these things. And one of the great, if you call it negative comedies of the Romantic movement, is that Thomas de Quincey, who arrived on the scene, I mean, it's very hard not to laugh. When de Quincey arrives into this group of people, it transpires he's slightly younger than them. He, of course, is an inveterate, awful addict as well. I shouldn't use the word awful, but I mean awful in terms of for the Wordsworth household and for people who are trying to plant their vegetables and have an ordinary life with children. It's like, my God, here's another addict. Here's a person who's going to just sit on the sofa all day, want to read what they've written and talk. And this is the nightmare. This is what Aria has pointed out, that, and I'm staying on the point, Coleridge tries, you see, this is the sad thing about him, God love him, is that when he runs out of the ability to write the poems, which is an ethical and moral thing for him to be doing, he's a poet, he must be writing, he's going to feel awful. He will go back to his substances to try and induce the situation. But that, I think, has brought then in the whole concept, I won't go off on an attack about saying the one time I met Allen Ginsberg, having a discussion about this, it's maybe another time. But Coleridge, when he was on one of these, we call it trips. I mean, this is where we look to America. and wonder how much of that poetry that was written from 1955 to 1985 seemed to have cigarette papers and syringes thrown all over the manuscripts. I mean, but I mean, such is the thing that from the Timothy Leary era, before Timothy Leary got fecked out of Harvard University and was saying to people like Robert Lowell, well, look, let's just maybe take some LSD and have a look at the grass. Pick a tulip and take some LSD and eat some of it, you know, sleep with some of it, you know, walk on some of it. So the position is that Blake will tell us that the poet can find the poems coming from any possibility. But of course, for poor Coleridge, it's when they're not coming. And I think nobody who's poets want to talk like this, that one will want to keep going. But let me just interject one thing, and I think it's of course true. Aria saying about the difficulties. I mean, the jingoistic phrase that Coleridge slept on the Wordsworth's couch for 2 years, and I mean, those of us who've done. Okay, confession time. Those of us who stayed with friends for a month on a couch, suddenly, you know, the guy's girlfriend is going to say to you, you want to move your girlfriend into the couch as well now? What the blank is going on here? Like you came on a Friday night with a bottle of wine. Now it's like a Friday 4 weeks on. Coleridge, of course, stayed. I wasn't talking about anybody in particular there, but Coleridge particularly did couch hop for the 2 years. But the magnificent somber music is that Coleridge helped Wordsworth to write his greatest work, the Prelude. And when you come to the final book of the Prelude, I don't know if I can read this because this is the thing about the Romantic poets. There is a top surface of emotionality within them. Just as he goes, imagination having been our theme, or just maybe 6 or 7 lines. This is book conclusion, he calls it. Imagination having been our theme, so also hath that intellectual love. For they are each and each, and cannot stand individually. Then you skip forward. With such a theme, and then he exclaims, Coleridge, with this my argument of thee, shall I be silent, O capacious soul, placed on this earth to love and understand, and from thy presence shed the light of love? Shall I be mute ere thou be spoken of? Thy kindred influence to my heart of hearts did also find its way. Thus fear relaxed her overweening grasp. Thus thoughts and things and the self-haunting spirit learned to take more rational proportions. So when you go down through that closing 2 pages, and it is about a 4-page canto, and this is not about, which is not my particular disposition. This is not about a man or a woman and a, you know, this is not you know, about Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas having a physical relationship and an emotional relationship and an intellectual relationship. I'm just making that point for the point of the fact that these 2 chaps, as the English would say, were helping each other at the writing desk. And Coleridge, I mean, Wordsworth, of course, we know that Wordsworth went very establishment and had a lot of guilt about his life. It was a burden. It was his albatross for the last years. He was made poet laureate and he found it a terrible burden. He was asked to write some poems for the monarchy and he told them to blank off. He didn't want to do that kind of work. But he found himself in his final days saying, my conscience is making me now write about Coleridge. It is very, very emotional. And when he writes the lament for Thomas Hogg, a kind of a more remote friend of his, what is really lovely is that the poem, as well as being a lament for Hogg, Coleridge starts invading the whole poem. So Coleridge, I think, at the end of play, as one says, he did get his work done, but of course he's very much like, you know, the extraordinary Schubert unfinished symphony. A lot of his work are unfinished symphonies, but tremendous in that we have any parts or portions of them as well. Very long answer, Nathan. Perhaps you didn't fall asleep.
No, Nate's still over there in the chat room. He's still kicking. He ain't going anywhere. You can't stop Nate.
He's taking opium, of course. Now, this is what you're doing. Well, you'll be brought into a courtroom. You'll be like Blake. You'll be brought to a courtroom. Hope not.
Yes. Well, let's hope not. And yeah, for you, Aria, do you feel, or maybe tell us about your process of writing poetry? Do you feel it's like the Greek enthusia, where the god just takes over? It's a sort of demon possession, or is it more mechanical and intellectual? Is it a little of column A and a little column B?
A little of column A and a little of column B. When I was writing my book for Byron, which I think was volume 6 of the Romantic series, I read so many things, and in particular the conversations between him and Lady Blessington, that it got to the point where, I would literally hear Byron in my head yelling at me, which was kind of interesting. I'm trying to sleep and I hear him yelling at me. So I got to the point where I had my journal next to the bed with a pen, so I could just get up in the middle of the night, turn on the light and write, which was very helpful. But then what I do is, in the morning I would get up and then transcribe everything onto Word and edit it. So to me, it's a process. My process is I read, I write, I edit. And the editing part is more like sculpting. So, if you go to this, Michelangelo, and I always think of what he said about the David, that the David sculpture was always there. He just unearthed it. And I think that way about poetry too, is it's sort of a minimalist thing too, where you chip back until you get exactly what you want. And I think, the other thing too is with Byron, and I really believe this is, he really said that, that he never corrected anything. And I find that to be rather disingenuous because, we all do. And it's his beautiful way of always being rather contradictory. He would say, I'm a very pious man. And then he goes off and sleeps with his half sister. So, he did. And, and the other really rollicking thing about that is while his wife was pregnant, his half sister was pregnant too at the same time. And they were all living in the same house.
Oh dear.
Yeah. But, I also go back to Byron in the sense that I think often that he was born in the wrong time period in a sense, because the poor man was definitely bisexual. He was definitely somebody who had bipolar disorder and, needed somebody to take him by the hand and, not just give him a diagnosis, but for God's sake, give him some therapy. At the same time, I think to him, and I think a lot of poets, and I also feel this way, is that poetry can be very much like therapy. Not that you want to spew out like some confessional, because I try not to do that, but that it's cathartic, even in the middle of writing, something that is romantic and is classically formatted, but it's still a cathartic process, because if it's not cathartic, then you're not going to reach your audience. And so that's why, to me, I said it's both, because you need to be able to, delve into your muse and talk to her, and at the same time, weed back, so that you get it to be exactly the way it should be.
Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
I think I'm going to I'm going to read a few lines of Byron to Aria, because there's one major question I want to ask about Byron, and follow along what Aria is saying. Having problems with your name again, Aria.
Opera.
It's back to elocution classes for Kevin. No, we'll thank you, Miss Smith. I have it, Aria. But no, Byron, of course, is in a completely different league. There is not a metaphor to qualify. If you put Blake, under the tree out there, and Wordsworth and Coleridge and Shelley and Keats. You have to then conjure up Byron passing in a coach on 39 horses, you know, dressed like, let me be rude to Elton John, whose music I'm not a particular fan, and I certainly don't wear those kind of clothes or sunglasses. Sorry, Elton John, you can sue me, I'm Irish. But the thing about it is that he's that type of, you know, larger than life character, but behind, if we can't take the kind of the clothes and the conversation and knocking over tables and the deliberate, what we call bad social behavior, behind that multi-layered person is one of the most, I mean, Aria, I think, is agreeing with me there, one of the most extraordinary poets of all time. It is an incredible, I cannot believe, again, though, back on, and I don't want to ride too much on this today, because I'm ever watchful of the occult. I absolutely say that, and I shouldn't say it, but that because one should protect oneself in any kind of a discussion. But Byron, unfortunately, in the very last poem he wrote, and in some of the early poems, he's telling you that something is going to, not just that it's going to go wrong for him, but like people like our guy here, who's a huge icon now here, people like Oscar Wilde, massive people knocking on the door saying, Oscar, this is going to go belly up. Marquis de Sade, Paul Verlaine, Arthur Rimbaud. Arthur, can I just give you, as a buddy, give you a piece of advice? It's a bit like blank off. But the thing is that Byron, in the last poem, it's not comic, but it's hard not to laugh at a lot of Byron's antics. When Byron is down in the midst of Greece and decides that he will take a break from the extraordinary work on Don Juan, he said, I'm going to take a break. What I'm doing is I'm going to hire some troops. I'm going to get some money from the British government, because of course she's Lord Byron. I'm going to kit out a ship with sailors. I'm going to go into the battle. Byron will now become a soldier. I've decided it's best for me to go to war. I've been writing about war. I've already written my heroic characters. Childe Harold and Don Juan are these swashbuckling soldiers. And you think that, as if you're very young and you're reading him and you don't know how he ended up, you think, geez, he's the most, he can box and he can swim, but he doesn't know jack sh about soldiering. So Byron, but to come back to the situation, Byron is you know, both the leader and founder of the whole romantic movement and the icon, but yards ahead of these people. It's a bit like equating, you won't enjoy this, but it's a bit like equating Donald Trump to a guy who's selling matches and secondhand newspapers on Fifth Avenue. I mean, you're exactly in the same league as comparing Byron to the other poets, because Blake is very much like the guy. Blake, as we know, sold a couple of copies of his poems, could hardly sell his paintings. He's the Vincent van Gogh of the era. But let me put this across to our Aria, and we'll keep Smith pacified. It goes like this. There's an accusation that Byron, because of this, and we have to talk about sexuality, as Blake tells us. Byron, of course, explains in Don Juan that he had sexual relations with his, I don't know what the word, nanny or nursemaid. I mean, us guys will have to face up to this. You see, there's no problem for a man of 50 having a sexual relationship with a consenting woman, you know, who's 25 or 26. I'm watching what I'm saying here now. I know it's a dangerous area, but Byron alludes to this in his long poem, that he was, you know, at a tender age, and there was a lot of sexual activity, and oh my God, something's happened now. Hello, we're still on.
Yeah, we're still on, Kevin.
Still there.
It's Byron.
The ghost of Byron, who is the grandfather of computers, you know, computer programming.
Really?
Yeah. Lady Ada Lovelace was his daughter.
But I'll give this to Aria. This is the accusation. I'm not making it against him. That there's many of these Spenserian stanzas. Aria. Here's one, and they're all pretty. They all tend to start attacking females because there's 5 or 6 women in Don Juan. Here's a typical one. Now it's very hard to know. Do you laugh or do you smirk or do you not laugh? They erred as aged men will do, but by and by we'll talk of that. And if we don't, 'twill be because our notion is not high of politicians and their double front, who live by lies, yet dare not boldly lie. Now that's brilliant on the politicians. I think we can all agree with that. But here he comes then attacking the female. Now what I love in women is they won't or can't do otherwise than lie, but do it so well, the very truth seems falsehood to it. So continually in the relationships of Don Juan, when the romance is over and when they're breaking up and he's being, you know, this steely, very macho guy and saying, you know, pull yourself together. I mean, you know, we were in Venice, we were in Greece. I mean, it's over, pack your bag, get out of here. He then tends to, so how do you feel about that in Byron?
A couple things. First, I wanted to go back to what you said about the nursemaid. That is true. It was actually a nursemaid that was supposed to take care of him because of his foot. She would get drunk, and it was actually sexual assault. He didn't really talk about it till he was much older. And it was something that had to be pried out of him by his mother. And it's one of those things that, you know, as a parent, when I read that, it really upset me. And, you know, the other thing is, I think that he was very much a dual personality when it came to women, because while he would say that, at the same time, he was really, he says he really admired certain female writers. He really liked Madame de Stael. He thought she was just prolific. And, you know, women, after they read Childe Harold, would send him passages that they wrote of their own poetry. And of course, one of them was from Lady Caroline. And he loved her poetry. And it's the reason that he went back to her, because her poetry was so good. So I think that he had this inner war with himself when it came to women, because on the one hand, he was attracted to men. On the other hand, he was attracted to women. But I think he was denying who he was because society said you can't be this way. And then I recall reading that he, on his journeys to Turkey, that there was a lot more sexual freedom. And at the same time, he saw men who were guillotined for being gay. And there's some just horrific passages in the book Byron, Life and Legend regarding that. This just will make you squirm as to the way that homosexuals were treated. And so I think because he witnessed that and he was a witness to it, it's one of those things that made him, you know, feel like, okay, I have to write this love poem, but I'm going to change the pronoun because I don't want to be castigated. And this happened with Lord Clare, who he loved till the day he died, you know, and and, you know, there's that famous scene where he saw Lord Clare years later and they were walking on a road and he saw him, and the two of them, it could have been, you know, a movie scene, ran to each other and hugged each other. And he said something along the lines of that he was so happy to see him because he never felt like he could be himself with anyone else. And that Lord Clare would always be in his heart. And so it's very difficult because, like I said, I mean, if he were in today's modern age, he would feel a lot more comfortable in the sense that he could be himself. And I think part of that not being able to be yourself is what made him say things about women that, you know, seem hateful, seem, you know, that are, you know, seem as if he was really putting women down. But at the same time, like I said, he's this huge mass of contradictions. And I would I would ask anybody if they really, really wanted to get a really good feeling of him to read the Conversations with Lady Blessington, because the cool thing about reading those is it feels like when you're reading them, like he's in the room with you, like he's literally right there. And the reason is because she was an autodidact, so she remembered the conversations verbatim, even 3 years after they were done, which is pretty amazing. So that's my take on it. And I've often kind of bored with myself with that, because it's kind of like, I love him, but there are things about him that really anger me. So I always say, of the two, of Shelley and Byron, I would love to go off and have a mad affair with Shelley, because there's just something sweeter than sweet about him.
Great.
And and with Byron, I would just like to have the longest conversation, just sit down and talk to him, because I think it would be truly fascinating.
But I think, to say this, and I mean, I'm very glad I'm not competent to comment on Byron and women. I think it would. I'm sure people have done work on it. If I was less busy in what I'm doing, I wouldn't mind having a crack at it. But I don't think I want to. But the thing is that he is, of course, a singular personality. Byron is a precursor, isn't he? He's a precursor of Nietzsche and so many people. He's possibly, I loathe to say this because of my own politics, which I won't get into. He's an extraordinary kind of Englishman for being an Englishman to me being an Irishman. I can't believe that I think he's probably more Scottish than Irish. I'm getting a bit crazy now. But Byron is the beginning, I'm saying now what was said in 1824, 25, 26, 27. Byron is the beginning of the modern person, leaving aside whatever his sexuality is. He's the modern individual who will speak. He's extremely valuable, I notice, in my own. I consider it studying Byron. Byron is the easiest of all these people to read. He is so utterly entertaining, so utterly amusing. He considers, that travel is a kind of a bagatelle. He has got so many types coming in and out of Don Juan that, he's filmic. I don't know why somebody can't maybe film this thing. Can we get Oliver Stone or somebody who's unstoned, as we say over here, to make a movie of Don Juan? And of course, there's been so many plays. Bernard Shaw, as we know, spent a long time reading this poem and rereading it, and then suddenly said, oh my God, I'm going to write a whole play about this poem. So he wrote his famous play about the beginning of the personal man and Superman. As he said, I can get nothing from Nietzsche from my play, but I can get everything from Byron. So I think when we think of Blake in London in his little shop, and we think of Wordsworth, getting the shock that he's the poet laureate and saying, I don't want to get involved with the royal family. And I say, Kevin Kiely says, yee hee for you. Well done, Who wants to go into Buckingham Palace? But the thing is that Byron is a completely different character. It's thrilling to me, thrilling to think that Byron stood up in the House of Commons, and I won't get expletive, but he was able to get expletive in the House of Commons. And it's thrilling that what he wrote about Castlereagh and said this should be Castlereagh's epitaph, and which just isn't strange. I wouldn't mind reading out the 4-line epitaph that Byron wrote for Castlereagh, but it's just so full of expletives and scurrility and low life kind of. I'm trying not to use 4-letter words today, but you think to yourself, wow, Byron just got up in the House of Commons, hated the English Parliament, hated the monarchy. It is incredible. If I had the funding, I would build even though Shelley came to Dublin and Wordsworth came to Ireland, I wish there was a statue of Lord Byron up the street. I mean, he's a terrific modernist. Before there was ever there were no modernists. That was his problem. There wasn't company that Byron could have a good time with.
Wonderful. Yes, I know. Where I'm from, in Lisbon, outside in Sintra, in the mountains of Sintra, Lord Byron had a apartment there. It's very famous there. Walked by there many times. And I should mention too, yes, it was William Blake was in jail, I believe, in the same at the same time Thomas Paine was incarcerated. In fact, there's a play, I think it's fictional, where they have a conversation. But
it isn't. But stay. I mean, one wants to cover the ground. If somehow we move, one doesn't leave Byron. The one thing I should say about Byron, but I don't want to have a green flag swinging from the balcony here, is that Byron's very good friend and what you would call literary protector and literary inheritor is the Irish poet Thomas Moore. And in typical Byronic fashion, I mean, the Byronic definitely is the word. I remember being fairly young when I discovered Thomas Moore's light is not shining very brightly anymore, but his songs are sung in Irish America. I don't want to bring that up today, now let's Irish America go to sleep for a while. But Thomas Moore's songs and melodies are part of the. If you go down to a bar down the street here, you know you'll probably hear people singing one or two of them later. He's got that type of national characteristic like Walt Whitman. But the first time, and there's no problem in getting anecdotal. The first time Byron met Moore. Moore was just being a bit Irish and whatever, you know, he was just, as we say, you know, he was just being a bit provocative. And Byron said, simple, we'll settle this with a duel. And Moore thought, oh my God, I could just, you know, I might have knocked over the guy's drink and I might have said, you know, I liked the first poem, but I didn't like the second poem, you know. Now I'm going to have to get shot in the face over this thing, you know. So suddenly then when they picked the field or part of London, Byron, I think, said something like, "This would be the bar. I'm mishmashing it. Something like, I couldn't shoot you in a jacket like that, or something." You see, Byron had that type of, you know, you're not dressed properly for your funeral. That type of outlandish, and they became, you know, they went off for chops and mutton and potatoes and vegetables and got drunk for the afternoon. So Byron, of course, and I can stop it there. Byron is. Think of any extraordinary, artistic being, Paganini, Chopin, you know, Byron and Chopin, they wouldn't have had a drink. He would have said, "You're a dull character. You just play the piano and write these sonatas. Go back to Warsaw." You know, Byron wanted party atmosphere and the music, the dancing, everything. So it's very difficult not to pay huge tributes to him. And to show, I mean, I can remember very early on reading the English bards and Scottish reviewers as possibly one of the most subtle and beautifully written attack on your contemporaries than anybody. People have never done a poem like that. It's only about 8 or 9 pages. It is so utterly funny. And the great genius of it is that one does not know the poets or the situations or the events, but he puts them all through to you. So Byron is possibly in one level the leader of this romantic movement, but not in terms of the area of Gnosticism and metaphysics and philosophy.
I think in those terms, you probably have to give it to Blake. And, you know, the other thing I would also say, though, in terms of romantics, is that you have to include, even though it's a long time before this, Petrarch, because Petrarch was the first alpinist. And he, you know, in terms of his writing, he was really romantic. And because of him, we have the translations of Cicero and Ovid and Homer, because he rescued those and translated them from the Latin. And so we're very fortunate for that. And in reading about his life, you know, again, somebody who lived very full, but also, you know, struggled. But, you know, so he's another one that I would include. And then you mentioned William Cooper, who I would also include, and Robert Burns, who's, you know, struggled and, you know, unfortunately died in way too young, 37. And was, you know, you can say is the the poet laureate of Scotland, and also really wrote for the people. Not to mention a tremendous lyricist. People don't really think about it, but you know, the song that everyone sings at New Year's, Auld Lang Syne, was written by him. So
it is, you know, and being an interjector from the age of 4 or 5, I can get a bit noisy. Apology, Aria. Do you know what is a lovely thing when you come over here in your beautiful silver ship? When you come over here and drop anchor off Scotland, you'll have to come down to Dublin as well, and we'll go on a little pub crawl. But when you go up to Scotland, you will go, I hope, to Burns's cottage. And it really is. Sometimes one can go to these what they call literary shrines and think, oh my God, I don't know if I'm going to go in here. But Burns's cottage is very tastefully maintained, and what struck me was it's just right beside the river that he continually used to write in the poems, the Afton River. And you know what it is? You know what it is about it? It's actually, there's no pomp and circumstance. There's no rockets or noise. You just think, oh my God, this is where Burns was born. This is where the little boy came out of the house. So it'll be a bit like Wordsworth coming out of his little house in. That is the greatness of Wordsworth. I'm not saying that Wordsworth is better than Burns, but in a way he's a kind of a larger psyche. You think of Wordsworth coming out as a young person and just walking around. I've had the privilege, I'm a bit of a spoiled brat occasionally. I've had the privilege to go over there to Cumberland, and you think, oh my God, this is Cumberland, and it's all these little low hills. I'm sure now you people from America would think this is not the Rocky Mountains. These are not, it's not like going into Switzerland. And then you think, no, stop this. These are these hills that Wordsworth went up and down and walked around. And as he says, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my soul and all my moral being. All those lines that he wrote just about the landscape, because it being to him, in that line he quotes all the time, that he found in Spinoza that nature is the face of God. And he thought, oh, that's it. That solves a problem for a while. So that's the thing about that's the other side of the romantic movement, getting away from Byron. And if we can move on to Keats is the same. What do you think though about Keats? The fact that Keats is seen, I've come across some, even though I don't have arguments, Keats in a way is a very literary poet, because Keats is not so much writing about London that he lived in, or the medical background he had, or the landscape the way Shelley would be. He's writing about a bit like Miguel and I discussed the other day. He's a little bit of, there's a Yeatsian flair to him, that he's writing about ancient Greece, and he's writing about an imagined landscape.
Right, but I would also say with Keats, I think that the reason for that is because his own reality was so awful in a lot of ways that I think that was his escape, just like when he was learning to be an apothecary. They said that his journals, his medical journals, had doodles and poems all over it, because he was, he had to find a way. Because if you think about it, medicine at that time was so primitive. They would operate on people with zero anesthesia. So you're operating somebody and they're screaming their head off.
Exactly.
You go home with these noxious fumes all over your clothes. You've been with cadavers and sick people all day. And I think poetry for him was this escape, and plus the fact that so many of his loved ones were dying of consumption, which of course took his life, and his father's freak death, which was just beyond sad. Poor man was out riding, because, he was a saddler to one place to do his business, and fell off the horse and hit his head on a rock and died. And, so, Keats's mother was left to raise his family, and then the man that she married ended up being a terrible person. So I think, very, in a sense, kind of similar to Coleridge, in the sense that his reality was not a happy one. So writing for him was an escape.
Yeah, it's interesting you push on this, if I call, what would we call it, the creative panacea, the ameliorative actions of the creativity, which of course is the blessing. I mean, I don't know, if I wasn't writing poems, I mean, even though I'm doing God knows every other damn thing to stay alive, but there's a terrible there's a shocking privilege that one has been given these materials. But getting away with that from a moment, I still think that Keats, in his agonies, a drowsy numbness pains my senses, though of hemlock I had drunk, and Keats couldn't really get drunk or take the type of I was going to say heroin, excuse me, the opium, the candle black drop that De Quincey and Coleridge could take. But Keats, I think from his letters, I understand that he understood very clearly the complications that tuberculosis would have for him. And the whole, if you go back to the whole system, which I won't start again, the whole English system anyway was geared into the fact that if people were ailing, there was no such thing as a state or a crown thing there was no public services. You just threw yourself over a ditch. So what is remarkable is that Keats, in the midst of this, is able to produce the astonishing beauty, because it can be put forward very clearly that I dare say this, the intense beauty of Keats's lines in a certain respect would surpass the lines of Blake. And even when Wordsworth, what we might call runs a passage that is not glittering for a few lines because he's extrapolating, you suddenly think most of Keats, to use one of the phrases we have, it sort of does produce everything that you ever want. His use of they're all tending to use this Spenserian stanza. As we know, the Romantics, of course, look back very strongly towards Milton and Shakespeare and Spenser. And Spenser, I'm delighted to say that I'm becoming more acquainted with him as I was in an earlier part of my life. Spenser remains one of the most astonishingly musical poets. Astonishing. And these people, of course, who were close knew this and used it. But Keats's use of the Spenserian stanza at times will surpass some of the others. That is the achievement. And of course, he didn't manage to get a lot of poems written because he was so invalided and so debilitated. But I would like to think that all those statements that he made about the letter, that passage, Aria, I'm sure, the passage where he talks about the holiness of the imagination.
Yes.
Just these things are what you call, they're truer than what's happening here before us.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, Kevin. Yeah, want to take a couple of audience questions and then get to Aria and some of her poetry. So, Vince, what do you have for? Oh, and there's been a couple of donations. Truly appreciate the help. Heretics down there in the comment section. Bless you.
Yeah, one of these questions will probably trigger about 3 more hours of interesting discussion. So I'll take the one that's more, a little bit more circumscribed, which is Grant Morrison's Invisibles apparently has, oh gosh, I didn't write it down.
Has Shelley and Byron. I have a
Byron.
feeling that's coming from Nate, if I know.
Oh,
Grant
you
Morrison
good guess.
Yes.
So let's see, who do we want to address this to?
Any of you read The Invisibles by Grant Morrison? Scottish chaos magician?
No. We got no.
Let's go
all
to
right,
the next
so
question.
sorry, Nate. Okay, here's a nice general one. This is the 2-hour answer I could imagine. Kevin, this was directed to you, but Aria, you're welcome to chime in there on this. Where do you think the legacy of the Romantic poets is influencing us most today, or any time? But what the legacy? Where does the legacy have the most influence?
Have I been talking too much? No.
No. Please.
Okay. I answered that by saying exactly where Miguel came in, and without hyperbole, that Blake said that everything is holy. But of course, once you know that there's a worm in the rose, and once you know that there's, we're well aware of the garbage, and we're well aware of, though I don't like people saying, foxes are horrible, or, mice are horrible, or rats are horrible. They're not. They're also part of the thing. Or squirrel. There's people saying I don't like squirrels, and I'm saying, well, okay, well, maybe you don't like them. But so I think the situation is that the love of these writers, even God love us, we might have been accusing Byron of being a bit of a hellraiser there. The love of these writers for the natural world, the way Herman Melville loved all those times he was working on those boats, the way he just had this luminous image of this beautiful whale, which, haunted him to write this extraordinary book. The love of all these creatures is in those poets. And if you go through, I don't know if I'm able to go through the welter of global, warning. There's so many terms, but I noticed that they're being quoted, not so much as we know. Byron is keeping us right that politicians are a bunch of, as we know, blank blanks, most of them, 99.999, 100% of them. But the thing is that because they're immoral people and they're responsible for the world, and this is what Wordsworth, Shelley, we have to get this across today, Aria. Blake, Byron, Shelley, Wordsworth continually say politicians need to suddenly give us back the world. This is another feature of the Romantics. So not just the globalism, the political structures, the power structures, but particularly, and more importantly, within the whole spiritual realm, these poets are also saying to spiritual leaders, to what is the function of spirituality, the revelations, all of the, what we call sacred spaces, churches, temples, rituals. One of the primary things within these poets is the discussion of that as well. So it is an extraordinary agenda. When you pick up one of these people, when I just show all of them, without knocking over your machinery there, when I just show you that they're just the poems that Wordsworth wrote, and he addresses all of these particular issues. Now, I'm not very comfortable when he gets orthodox and at the end of his life, when he started writing all those hugely ecclesiastical sonnets. But so that's quite a high stack that one has built up there. So I'll pass it over to Aria.
So what was the question again?
Influence, the Romantic poets' influence on, their legacy on society.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I was so caught up in what Kevin was saying, I forgot the question. I think you can actually see their influence, and oddly enough, because on the one hand, you have a lot of poetry today that is anti-romantic and very prosaic, right? No rhyme to it at all. And so your meter is completely gone. But then, oddly enough, I think where you still have a lot of influence are two places. One is music, and the other one is rap music.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
And, it never hit me until I was listening to some rap that was on the beat with Ari Melber, and it hit me, wow, this is actually kind of really akin to classical poetry. If you listen to it, they still have the meter. It might not be as formatted as classical poetry is, but it has a similar structure. And the influence, you can see it's still there because it still has the same goal. And that goal is to influence the masses and create change. It's the same goal. It's just in a different guise. And, so when people say, I posted a poem the other day, and somebody wrote, oh, I had a college professor who told me never to use rhyme, and rhyme is out, and blah, blah, blah. So I wrote back and I said, well, where would we be without Shakespeare? Where would we be without Petrarch? Where would we be without Byron? because to me, those are the foundational poets that we have to look to. And again, Petrarch, because he is the father of the sonnet in Italy. And, you know, you can go back as far as Ovid and Homer, right? And they were talking and carrying a stick or a bully pulpit, talking about the masses and enlightening them, and, you know, and going to what Byron said about politicians, which he's right. He's absolutely right.
Well said indeed. And obviously their influence on the beatniks in the 60s and all that power. Again, I go to Blake's power and all of their power drawing from the classic times. So we want to talk about you, Aria, or your work. I read Hammer of the God last night. I really enjoyed it. Probably won't be surprised that I was looking for Gnostic themes. So of course I really enjoyed your poem, Father Destroyer. But would you like to recite one of your poems? Or I can recite Father Destroyer. And of course, you sent me some wonderful renditions, and I plan to put it on the audio version so that the audience can enjoy.
Sure. I have a couple that I actually highlighted to read.
Yeah, please do.
So you can tell me, you know, what suits your fancy.
Up to you. We'd like to hear it.
Okay, so let's see. This first one is actually from Blake, and it's about chimney sweeps. It's called Chimney Sweep Boys. Sooty warts, pinion racked, up the flue, filthsome flack, that curdles round ere rings the nose, and siphons life in duty's repose. Oh ho, the sweep, revered and damned, charred lineaments and bristle for hair, coarse and friable art his bones, coffin lined his thistle-thornt throne. Oh, the boy who blesses the bride and fills your nostrils with deep lustral sighs, for the tuppence ere the shilling tossed his way, that ye may gaineth entry in the blackened way. Oh, the angel that funnels up the tube, gallant and wretched to his last breath true.
Wonderful. And the chat room is really enjoying this poetry and bringing altered state of mind. So yeah, please recite another one if you want.
Sure. This one is, in a sense, more, I don't know, I want to say more Gnostic in the sense that it's for Lilith. And I don't know if your audience knows this, but Blake really revered Lilith because she was
really? Even I didn't know that. Wow.
Because she was strong and she refused to lie beneath Adam.
Mm-hmm.
And most people don't realize that.
Mm-hmm.
This is called Lilith's Sonnet. To ne'er be beneath the veil, his breath an anvil on her rests, restless spirit held, compressed. She demon in the throes, unrepentant in she goes. Her towering, wending, dangling arm fuels the oil, kindling anon. In her strident feet, the foot on the path, comes the seed. Plangent, forceful flower, dipped and vanquished o' her rightful power. She turns afore the mighty sun and wields the river, ascends and divvies further, a shadow of what may become.
Oh, beautiful. And I hope the audience enjoys that and can repeat it. Yes, we love in this show. Lilith is also a big patron, along with William Blake and all these other counter-revolutionaries or revolutionaries of history. Well, I want to read your poem, Aria.
Okay.
And then we can end with Kevin. Please think of a poem to end this, to bring the muse and to bring out the egregore and the gods down. Hopefully for a better world, at the very least for the entertainment and enlightenment of the audience. But I would like to read Aria's wonderful poem, Father Destroyer, and all her poems in the book are excellent. I advise you to get the book. I will have the link on the show notes for you. And here because this is more than just rhymes. This is truly the healing power of the gods, the God in the breast, as William Blake said. So here is Father Destroyer. His pear-worn face boring and impugning, renouncing and lying, hands that could bestow mercy or flail in the name of Christ. O pontiff pure, father destroyer, your scepter is jagged, wheeled, and impure. You lay siege, your eyes bleed. Swimming gondoliers through the wreckage you have secured. Thy head is spent in apostolic reverence. The thistles that crown you do not immure. Whilst I, in my blackening being, heave and sigh for understanding into the darkened horde. So needless to say, this is the type of poetry that I like. It's very powerful. So as we get to the end of the show, Kevin, would you like to end us with a poem? It could be yours or anybody you choose.
You're very kind to acknowledge my poethood. I can see there's about 10 people in Dublin now saying, my God, is it, we should get onto Miguel and have this guy put up into the mountains. No, I'm going to read a poem. Aria, very, very good to link up with you.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and I must keep in communication. And I'm very glad to hear you read your poems. I'm just going to give one line of T.S. Eliot on Blake, and then I'm going to read a poem by Blake called The Joy of Woman is the Death of Her Most Best Beloved. T.S. Eliot said, Blake's poetry has the unpleasantness of great poetry. So here goes the poem. Thank you, Vance. There was a moment there where the devil took over. I got back. Got an angelic click of something. From William Blake, from our dear, dear friend, and to all our dear friends, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, George Gordon Noel Byron, Percy Shelley, and William Wordsworth. So this is from William Blake. The joy of woman is the death of her most best beloved, who dies for love of her. In torments of fierce jealousy and pangs of adoration, the lover's night bears on my song, and the 9 spheres rejoice beneath my powerful control. They sing unceasing to the notes of my immortal hand. The solemn, silent moon reverberates the living harmony upon my limbs. The birds and beasts rejoice and play, and everyone seeks for his mate to prove his inmost joy. Furious and terrible they sport and redden the nether deep. The deep lifts up his rugged head, and lost in infinite humming wings vanishes with a cry. The fading cry is ever dying. The living voice is ever living in its inmost joy.
That was beautiful, and thank you. So we are at the end of the show. Unless, Vance, do you have a limerick you want to say, man from Nantucket or anything like that? Or are you gonna pass?
Oh, we were talking about AI writing poetry pretty soon, right?
Yeah, you know that's coming.
And so I wrote him an immediate poem, which is roses are 100 and violets are 001. Actually, it should be 101 for red and blue.
Cute. Well,
that's it.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Vance, for keeping the chat room company, and thanks to the chat room for keeping us company.
Yeah, thanks, guys. There. Apologies for any questions I didn't get to.
No worries. And so, Aria, thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte. And again, we will promote your book in the show notes when it comes on audio, and really enjoyed it. And good luck with everything. And thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
The pleasure is all ours. And Kevin, always great to have you on, and really appreciate you being here. As Vance called you, you are the poet's poet, and we really appreciate everything you do.
Oh gosh, that's very, very generous of you. No, I'm very glad to have Aria on board our ship today, and to have Vance on board our ship. It's fabulous. I think I might have a glass of wine, and I'm going to be honorable to our friends and maybe read one sonnet on my own here, just to have a complete honor. So I want to thank you because we can't use it. You're right. I can't use any of the names or titles we use today because Blake would say we can't somehow, you know, we have to be careful with our trajectory into destiny. I'm looking out now and I see the moon coming just up over those chestnut trees. So there we go.
Well,
Beautiful.
wonderful. Oh, that's great. Well, again, thanks everybody for coming on show. Thanks for everybody in the chat room. The audio will be out, and please go write your poetry, create your poetry. It's what keeps you alive, what makes you live the real life, and it honors those who are no longer with us and keeps them alive and immortal. So that's really the amazing thing we can do, and that's really one of the most divine things we can do. So thank you, everyone, and hello and goodbye, as always, as I like to say. Good night.
Good night.